Welcome to The Secrets of Success. By following the proven techniques of the guests who appear on this series, you'll learn that even successful people run into detours and failures, and how you can apply their success techniques to change your life.
You're now listening to the most unique show on radio, the show dedicated to making you a success. Are the leaders in your organization ready to create the outcomes that matter most? We'll find out today from our guest, Robert Anderson, author of Scaling Leadership. Bob, thanks for being with us.
Great to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Now, what does the expression scaling leadership really mean?
Well, the challenge in transforming organizations, especially as they grow into more and more complex environments, globalization and so on, is to scale your capability. So what we find with leaders over and over is they leverage what got them there, and then they get in over their head. And I'm speaking personally here. Bill and I, who wrote the book, run now an organization that's grown quite rapidly. So when we wrote the book, we said, well, we're not going to write this from a place of knowing, but from a place of standing with leaders who are really struggling with the kind of complexity that comes with growth. And so the challenge becomes, how do you scale the kind of creative, innovative, agile, adaptive capability and leadership in the organization? Otherwise, growth gets capped.
So if we're looking at an organization that we want to grow, scaling is basically keeping it running as well as it's been running, but at a larger scale. Is that in a nutshell?
Well, exactly. I can't mention the client's name, but very iconic client. We sat down with them pretty early in the engagement, said our leadership was exposed at scale. What worked at one level of scale didn't work very well at the next level of scale. So they're in the entertainment industry, and they, basically made the choice to double their business. And then some things happened internationally which doubled down on that again, and all of a sudden their leadership was inadequate to the scale that they were taken on.
We all think it would be so wonderful to grow and get as big as one of our competitors, but I guess it's not all that easy, and there's some things that you're going to warn us about that's going to come into play. You use an acronym VUCA, the Vuca Environment. Can you tell us what that stands for and why it's important?
Yeah, Bob Johansson, futurist, really coined the phrase, and he basically looks out at the future and says it's going to be a VUCA world: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I think if you ask him, and we did when his recent book came out, he said we haven't seen anything yet. The level of complexity and uncertainty and disruption that's coming at us is literally unprecedented.
So the word VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity,
and ambiguity.
Wow. If it was a horse race, I think we'd want to avoid betting on any of the horses under those conditions.
Well, that's the world we're living in.
I was going to say, though, unfortunately, it's what we're living in, and I guess even more so what you have to deal with, because your job is in management and taking care of companies that are growing, right?
Facing it every day.
Now,
so we write up Syngenta, and this, of course, is public knowledge, but they gave us permission to use some of the stories in the book, and they're basically were bought by China, and their challenge is to feed China, and do it safely, do it in a way that's environmentally safe, and so that's a huge, complex challenge, and it's 2-3x their business.
Now, in doing this and scaling leadership, am I correct? You actually researched literally thousands of people, how senior leaders define what works and what does not work, right?
Yeah. That was really the genesis of the book. The research blew us away. The results blew us away. So we have a database now of about 1.5 million surveys. So about 150,000 leaders have been through the Leadership Circle assessment, which is a pretty unique assessment in what it goes after, very in-depth. So we've got a lot of measures on effectiveness and different styles of leadership all built into this one framework. And so we decided to read the written comments. So we sorted the database into very senior leaders from around the world, levels 1 through 3, maybe 4, but mostly levels 1 through 3, and the most effective, which we call creative, the most creative, and the most reactive or ineffective leaders. And then we sampled their written comments in the 360 assessments, and the difference between those two sets of comments was startling.
What was the one that surprised you the most, or you said, "Oh my gosh, I never would have thought of that"?
Yeah, there were a number of surprises. The first one was when we looked at the top 10 list for the most creative or effective leaders. These are the strengths that were most often described in the written comments. So the researchers identified 40 strengths or themes that were often mentioned. And so when you sort those 40 strengths from highest to lowest for the creative leaders, the top 10 list shocked us, principally because 6 out of 10 of them had to do with developing people and teams.
Wow.
And it just, and then we were surprised by why we were so surprised, because, we've been talking about this forever, and yet we've kind of lived our work inside of a database, and when you look at it, you can see that things like vision and strategy and results and focus and so on tend to carry the day statistically. Relationship is strong, highly correlated to effectiveness, but it's not as strong as, say, high achievement type skills. And so the comment data was just the opposite. In fact, focus on results didn't even show up in the top 10 list for the most effective leaders.
Wow. Bob, at this point, we like to remind our listeners, if you're just tuning in, you're listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm your host, Bill Horan, and today we're talking to Robert Anderson, one of the authors of the book, Scaling Leadership. Bob, before we go further, can you tell us where we can get the book and if there's a website where we can learn more?
Yeah, if you just go to scalingleadership.com, we have a little website there, and of course you can get it on all the booksellers, Amazon and Barnes and Nobles and 800 CEO reads and stuff like that.
And a little tip for our audience: if you're going out there and want some leadership positions, it doesn't hurt to know some of the buzzwords and what's being talked about in the management leadership world, and knowing the results of surveys such as Bob's group has done, that what makes a company successful. If you're going to a company, they're probably growing because they're adding people on if they're having you come in for an interview. And if you know some of these things, or at least are able to talk their language, you're certainly going to make a much better impression. Also would like our audience to know, if you've missed any part of this show, you can always go to nccradio.org and listen to the podcast, get the information back, or talk about it with your friends or coworkers. Bob, you talk about ineffective leadership, and you say something that almost seems obvious. You say that caps the ability of an organization to grow. And I don't think we've ever thought of it that way, because I've never heard it expressed quite that way. But if our leadership isn't effective, I guess it certainly makes sense. We're not going to get any better. It's like the manager of a ball team. They're not going to get any better if they have a poor manager, correct?
Exactly. I mean, there's the always kind of timeless statement of culture eats strategy for lunch, and who sets the culture? Well, it's the extended leadership team in the organization is the culture. To work on the culture of the top team is to work on the culture of the organization. So, and then, the effectiveness of leadership, the organization just is not going to perform at a level higher than the effectiveness of the senior leadership. So we have venture capital companies coming to us now on a pretty regular basis, and we know how to invest in the company, grow it, build a strategy, grow it to a point. And then we reach the point where the complexity that comes with growth outpaces the development of its leadership, and leadership becomes the cap on the next phase of growth. And so it's very interesting to see them coming to us saying, we need everything you've got because we can only grow this thing so far.
Now, you say you have to develop the capacity and capability in others, but how does a company do this? Do they do it internally? Do they bring outside groups in? Is it almost like a ball team when a new general manager comes in, he'll get rid of half the players and he wants his own, I guess, philosophy to come through? Or how do you advise companies to do this?
Well, certainly, and you've got to get the right people on the bus and in the right seats on the bus. That goes without saying. And often our clients will, after a couple of years of working with them, they will change out some of that leadership, and in some cases, a lot of that leadership, because they just, as you start to measure it and really make development and leadership performance a priority, especially collective leadership. How we show up together to really effectively lead the organization. You've got to have a really high-performing leadership team. As you really start to focus on that, the weak links show up. And so they either take on the development challenge, the agenda for development, and say, okay, I get it. I got to really expand my capability here, or you got to replace them. So we find the clients we work with doing a mix of that. Of course, we'd love to see it happen through development, but sometimes it's just not in the cards, or the person is resistant to what's being required.
Do managers and leaders today have to be good teachers? Is that almost a new requirement that they have to kind of, how a lot of people would say, I'm not here to teach you how to do your job type of thing. But I guess the way I'm reading your book, yes, you are here to teach me that, because the sooner I get better, the sooner the company gets better, and probably the sooner you get promoted. Is that the way it's going today?
Yeah. I mean, that's part of why we ended up with the notion of scaling, because when we saw the differences between the strengths of the really effective leaders, what we call high creative leaders, and and how different they were from the strengths of the high reactive leaders, we realized that the reason they're so effective is they scale themselves. It's people and teams, They're good interpersonally. They're good mentors. They develop the team. They listen well. Those kind of skills are really what differentiates the best from the worst. And so what they're actually able to do then is develop the people around them and grow leadership. That's the number one job of the senior leader, is to take on the development agenda and develop other leaders. And so it isn't so much you have to be a good teacher or know it all. What we find is that the leaders who step in and say, okay, in order for our business to really grow, we as a leadership team need to evolve and develop. And I also need to do that. I also have as much to learn in this as anybody in the organization. So it starts very personally and vulnerably. So the leaders we see that have the most transformative impact are what we call radically human, and they own their need for development, and they do it publicly, and they step into it, and they set up feedback mechanisms for themselves, and then they get the whole team involved in that very same development agenda, and they're much more willing to take it on because the leader, him or herself, has taken it on. And so it's less about teaching, and it's more about saying, we're all in a boot camp here. We call it a spiritual boot camp. You cannot not be over your head in this kind of environment. We're all facing a development gap. No shame in that. Let's just get on with it and support each other.
I love that expression, radically human. Bob, at this point in the show, I'm going to be radically human and remind our listeners that you're listening to The Secrets of Success. My name is Bill Horan. The show is produced at the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. We'll be right back after this brief break.
The average time a resume spends on an HR manager's desk is 7 seconds, and most of them are tossed aside. Now imagine if one of those resumes belonged to Yasmin, who was
living in a shelter, juggling 3 jobs. I had to be resilient. That's something that you can't teach.
Or if that resume was from someone who
worked 12-hour shifts at the recycling company with my dad, who's 72. That taught me a work ethic that I carry with me every day.
We rely so much on a resume, yet it could never tell the full story of someone.
Growing up where I did, a lot of things could have gotten in the way of my goals. But I learned to push through, and that's what I bring to work every day.
So maybe it's time we look beyond the resume and look to Grads of Life. Discover new ways to develop great talent that are so much more than what's on paper at gradsoflife.org. A public service announcement brought to you by Grads of Life and the Ad Council.
Welcome back. You're listening to The Secrets of Success. I'm your host, Bill Horan, and today we're talking to Bob Anderson, author of Scaling Leadership. Bob, you mentioned in your book 6 conditions required to scale. Can you tell us what those are?
Well, the first one is this shift we're talking about from reactive to creative. It's a fundamental shift, both of mind and capability. We've got all kinds of measures on the difference in effectiveness between these two kinds of leadership. And we were working with a client recently, and they've taken on a massive organizational transformation effort, big pharmaceutical company, to become more agile and more innovative and adaptive in the way they run their organization. And it's a big shift. And we were with them recently, and senior team is looking at it and going, we literally cannot create the kind of agile, adaptive culture and organization that we're envisioning unless we make the shift from reactive to creative. And the shift in leadership is a requirement. So that's the first condition. The second is what we just were talking about, radically human. So the leaders that really scale leadership do it from a place of vulnerability. They learn out loud. They get feedback. They don't start from a place of knowing. They start from a place of learning, and invite others to join in. I was just corresponding with a very senior leader in Europe, big, large insurance company, and he's really taken on this development agenda for his organization, but he's doing it from a place of invitation. So let's create an energy in the organization that actually draws people in. And that's what the senior team has taken on. So that kind of learning out loud, radical humanity, and then they do it in teams. They do it in relationship. So deep relationship. If you look at the top 10 skills, great leaders are good at relationships at every level of scale. One on self, a relationship with myself, deepening and growing. One-on-one and mentoring and coaching and developing, one on team, one on organization. And so in large organizations with really effective creative leaders, people feel like they know them, like they have a personal relationship with them, even though their level of contact might not be all that often or through various larger forums and so on. So capability for relationship is really, really important. And then it's systems awareness is one of them, the ability to then design into systems, into the organization systems for development and really make development a long-term sustainable project. Purposeful achievement. Every organization we work with that is becoming really high performing is driven by a higher purpose, something to which people are really passionate about or committed to. It's worthy of their life's commitment, and it captures their imagination and pulls them into giving their discretionary energy and pulls them into their own development. It's like, if we're going after that, I have to grow, I have to evolve, I have to become even better than I am now. And so then the last one is generative tension. Generative tension is this amazing thing that leaders do. They create a tension in the organization. It's a gap between what we aspire to or envision and our current realities. And they're pretty fierce about telling the truth about both. So what is it we really are collectively committed to and focused on, and getting that really, really clear, and then into strategies and strategy into execution and so on. And then at the same time, measuring and assessing where are we and how are we doing against that, both in terms of business performance, but also in terms of our own leadership effectiveness or the culture we're trying to create or engagement scores and so on. So you're constantly working the gap and holding in tension the discrepancy between what we're aspiring to and where we are.
Bob, before we go further, we'd like to let our audience know that, in case you didn't hear it before, you're listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm your host, Bill Horan, and today we're talking to Robert Anderson, author of Scaling Leadership. Bob, can you tell us, if someone is looking for the book or wants to know more from the website, what is that website we can go to?
Well, you can go to scalingleadership.com. or any of the booksellers, Amazon, our own leadership circle website has access to the book as well.
And if your company is looking to grow and you want to be part of that, you might start throwing around some of these terms. When the boss asks you where you got it from, tell them you're listening to The Secrets of Success. You know Bob Anderson, and you're reading the book Scaling Leadership. If you didn't hear the whole show, you can go to nccradio.org and listen to a podcast of the show, or if you want to listen to it again and get some more information. Bob, you mentioned in the book that leadership is often reactive or creative. I would think that you'd want to be creative. Is that the direction most want to go?
Yeah, and what we don't mean by that like creativity. What we found is actually the most creative and most reactive leaders are also they're scored high, and the comments are both equal around creativity or innovation or brilliance or intellect. So these are really, really creative, talented people. Equally talented, and yet being experienced as leaders, very, very different.
Now, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No,
go ahead.
I want you to finish. Were you finished with that, or did I cut you off?
Yeah, no. What differentiates leadership is not your creativity, your intellect, your brilliance, even your results focus, your domain knowledge. These folks were equally described on those kinds of strengths. And that was one of the big findings in our book. One of the big findings was what got you there won't get you where you're going. That these kind of skills are essential there, but at senior levels, they're table stakes. So I've been listening to how you position this as we've gone through this seminar. It's like, if you're thinking about moving up, get moving into your next job. Well, these kind of skills, around strategy and execution and results focus and domain knowledge and so on. This stuff is essential and doesn't differentiate the best leaders from the worst. So there's another set of skills that need to be developed along the way, and that's what defines creative leadership.
Now, Bob, you have an expression, and you say that leaders bring the weather. What does that mean?
Yeah. Well, one of our clients said that, and it literally just means when the leader walks in the room, everybody knows what the weather is. Everybody knows the mood. Everybody gets right away whether it's safe or not to talk about what you really think. They know right away if we can be open and honest. So leadership, everybody looks to leadership, and that defines in large measure what can happen in the room.
Now, I think you mentioned in your book that when you go into an organization, you actually ask people to pick out the leaders who they admire and respect and appreciate. And if I got the math right, I think you said that 80% usually name the same 2 or 3.
Yep.
And I have 2 questions from that. Like, what is it about those people they think so highly of? And what is it you take from that? Is that a good thing that you have some standards to go for? Or is that bad, meaning the others are all deficient? Or will we always have a few people at the top?
Well, one of the things it means that we know what good leadership is. Because the kind of people that we describe in one organization is not different than the kind of people that get described in another organization. So this is a very interesting thing. We all know leadership's important. We never get any pushback to the question, does effectiveness in leadership matter to business performance? Everybody agrees with that. And then what we now know is that everybody knows what it is and what it looks like, and yet very few really emerge and embody what we're calling creative leadership, and those are the kind of leaders that get described over and over and over, and it came through in the written comments. So they're really good with people and with developing teams and listening and supporting the development of leadership in others. They're really passionate and clear about what they stand for. They're people of high integrity, and they're approachable and personable. And so all these things that got described in the written comments that we studied are what we hear when we go and say, who's the best leader you know of in the organization, and why do you think so? They tell us the same thing.
And I guess that validates what you found, and that's why those people are on the top and probably will be the ones moving around because they have all the best qualities. Bob, we want to...
But here's the interesting thing is we've heard for years this notion of the Peter principle, that you reach your highest level of incompetence and then you cap out. Well, that's a really great notion, and your career is finished. You may be 50, but you've reached the highest level of your capability. What we find is that that's not the case anymore, that the underperforming leaders were equally talented as the high creative, high effective leaders. So we think it's not so much a matter of capability, but a matter of development.
Oh, I like that. That's room for all of us.
That makes room for all of us, and we know how to develop that kind of creative mindset and stance and leadership. And so you're not capped out because you meet a certain level. You're probably in over your head at a level of complexity, and you're facing your level of development.
I'm capped out now because we're out of time, but we want to thank our guest, Robert Anderson, author of the book Scaling Leadership. Thanks for being with us today. We'd like to remind our audience that you've been listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm your host, Bill Horan, asking you to please join us again next week at the same time when we will continue our journey to success.